Hey, welcome back to the channel and to episode 2 of our read-along book club of Christopher Buehlman's Those Across the River, a book that allegedly has werewolves in it or some kind of dog-like creatures according to the cover, but we have yet to find them, or have we? We've met someone with very sharp teeth in this week's reading, and in case you didn't remember, we are covering chapters 6 through 10 in this episode. So in chapters 1 to 5, nothing really happened out of the ordinary. We had some little hints of something weird going on. We had what could be sacrifices of these pigs to somebody across the river in the forest. We had a very strange note from Orville, our protagonist's aunt, that insisted he leave this place. And that letter devolved into what some may deem madness. It felt very Lovecraftian in that way. But finally, we're getting somewhere in this episode with chapters 6 through 10. So let us get into the writing. But before I go on, let me make a little prediction here. I alluded to it a little bit in the last video, but I'm thinking that, and maybe this is obvious, I'm not sure, but I'm thinking that these creatures, these people we meet one of these people in chapter 7, I believe, but I'm thinking that they are of the same line of the slaves that killed Orville's great-great-grandfather, and have somehow, laid claim to this land, and the people who live nearby have made a pact with them to give them these pigs and feed them, I guess. I don't know, make sacrifices to them. I'm not sure if we're going to get into the occult or anything like that, but there's some things in this these subsequent chapters here that feel like they're alluding to that. So I don't know if there's some kind of dark magic or rituals at work here. We'll find out, but that's my guess. I'm thinking these people from across the river are related to, or maybe in fact the same people, the slaves that took down Orville's great-great-grandfather and the plantation, but we shall see. So let's see how this pans out. It is documented in this video. If I am right or wrong, we will find out. So chapter 6, what happens in chapter 6? Well, we make it to the social. The social, Orville and his love, Eudora, make it to the social. And I think the most notable thing about this entire chapter is the fact that we meet a new character, a very interesting man named Martin Cranmer, who is the taxidermist. And Orville's sitting here getting ready to eat some fish heads apparently on this table, and some kid takes them all, even though he says, hey, go ahead, take them, kid. And then his mother chastises the little boy for taking them because, she doesn't want him to be rude. She wants him to save the fish heads, share the fish heads. But anyway, that is neither here nor there. That is a little introductory scene to Mr. Cranmer's, I don't know how to say it, entrance. And he has quite the voice. He's a very funny character. I loved a lot of the dialogue he had here. And in fact, it begins when he first is introducing himself to Orville. My name's Cranmer, Martin Cranmer, taxidermist. But you already know that. I saw some of them old chickens pointing and whispering. Doubtless you've also learned about my cannibalism and ties to the Communist Party. So immediately you love this guy. And then Orville mentions a young John Brown, who I'm assuming is this John Brown, born May 1800 and died in 1859. He was an American abolitionist leader, first reaching national prominence for his radical abolitionism and fighting in Bleeding, Kansas. He was eventually captured and executed for a failed indictment of a slave rebellion at Harper's Ferry preceding the American Civil War. So that's what I'm thinking he's referring to. But less by his appearance, as noted here, and more by what it was that hinted at some denomination of madness. A lush but forbidding dark beard mostly hid Cranmer's mouth and stood out in contrast to his suit. And this is what's funny too. He's got this weird suit that's very small, so it was cream colored, short at the wrists and crotch, and so ill-fitting generally that it might have been sent mail order 2 sizes small and not returned out of indifference. Oh, and I messed up the voice there when I read his line because I forgot. Cranmer didn't have the drawl everybody else in town had. He actually said, I like, and not I like. What was that accent? Midwestern? And we continually get more quips of Mr. Martin Cranmer here. Nothing against the Jews except they like their money and they killed Jesus. But if they hadn't, we wouldn't have anything to sing about on Sundays. There's a ton of clever lines in this, and these are the kind of characters I love most that just kind of jump off the page at you. They may feel a little bit like a caricature, but I think sometimes on the page you need to exaggerate a little bit more because we don't have the performance of an actor as if we're dealing with a film. We don't have the cinematography or anything like that or the look. It's all in our imagination, and so I think it works perfectly well here. And he's actually quite the pleasant surprise in this book. Not that I'm not liking this book. I'm enjoying this book quite a bit. But I highlighted this, have you met my wife, I said. Last episode, I forgot if they were married or not. This made me think they were, and then later on we find out they're not because of the syphilis test that they have to get married. The premarital test that was mandated, I believe, in 1935 when I looked it up. So they are keeping it a secret, the fact that they are out of wedlock, because, you know, it's a very religious community. They don't want to give anybody the wrong idea here. And the next hilarious line from Martin Cranmer is when Orville says, "Are you a married man?" And he says, "What do you think?" "I think a wife wouldn't let you keep that beard." And he says, "Good. An honest man, me too. Honesty's why I like hookers. Have to ride a fuck all long way on my bicycle for that, though." And he continues again, "I haven't done that since the war," I said. "What, ride a bicycle?" That either. So Cranmer, he's a very interesting character. He carries this entire chapter. But we learn that he's very interested in our protagonist, because right here he says, "Quite honestly, you're the only reason I put on this ape suit and pedaled out here. I'm flattered. They say you're educated, a professor of history. Me, I'm self-educated. I like books. I like to talk about books." And so he's very interested in Mr. Orville here because he is an educated man, because he likes to read books, because he likes to talk about books. And he's hoping to find someone who can match his mental capacity. And I believe he makes fun of religious here. Yeah, right here. So no offense, but most of the God-fearing folk around here have trouble reading a can of soup. I mean, they'll whip your biscuits in a game of checkers at the general store, which we've been to before. And most of them can quote Genesis and Exodus all right, but chess is right out. The most political they ever got was when half of them wrote letters to Sears and Roebuck when they switched the catalog to glossy paper. I'm curious if that must be a very historically accurate thing. Otherwise, I'm not sure why he would be that specific. But as one of our members on the Discord and one of the viewers in this channel alerted me of, there is an anachronism in this series. And I'll get to that when I get there, because I highlighted it so I would not forget. And I know I highlighted a lot of these, but they're totally worth repeating. When Orville asked him, "So does a self-educated man find satisfaction in the preservation of dead animals?" And he says, "Satisfaction? Not exactly, but when I make a good mount, I feel like I beat God in a small way, as though the Almighty said, 'Let thus and such critter be dead,' and I said, 'Fuck you, he can still play a banjo.'" And he asked him, "Are you a devout man, Mr. Nichols?" And he says, "I can't say that I am." "Excellent. We might be friends, but we won't hunt together." "I don't hunt. I know." "Excuse me?" And this is when we learn that he found Orville. When Orville was out with Lester was showing him around the forest. Cranmer was out maybe looking for more animals to taxidermize. Yeah, there was a rabbit warren nearby, so he was looking for these animals and he spotted him. But why was he hiding? Why was he hiding indeed? And we are left with a very interesting line here. As observed by Orville, "I pictured Martin walking the bike through the rough terrain of the forest in his mismeasured suit, but the image did not make me laugh. No image of Martin Cranmer in the woods seemed improbable. He looked like he had been carved from the hardest tree in them." So we'll see if that's a bit of foreshadowing for what's to come, because I feel like Martin is going to play a very pivotal role in this story. He pops up a few more times, or maybe just one more time in this entire series of chapters. No, two. They're playing chess, and then also when Orville comes back after seeing what we're going to talk about very shortly. He reminds me of one of those characters that's just like, don't you ever go into those woods, right? You see them in horror movies all the time. Some kid discovers something, he's unraveling a mystery, and he meets an old guy who lives in the woods or nearby the woods who knows this mystery. I think it was in Pet Sematary even, if I'm remembering right, where that old man that lives across the street tells the main character to just never go to that pet cemetery or something like that. Or maybe I'm mixing it all up. This could be a horror trope. It most likely is a horror trope in other films as well. But if that sounds familiar to you, let me know in the comments. And finally, in chapter 7, Eudora didn't want me to go across the river on Wednesday. And last time, we knew that he was going to venture back into these woods, even though they were mean, according to Lester. There was something dangerous there across the river. And now that question is answered. He goes alone. He leaves Eudora. And there's a little interesting aside here. He's thinking about what she's up to while he's off venturing into this forest. And he says, "If there had been anyone around to bet, I would have wagered my best pair of shoes that she was in the study, nosing around in my affairs. Not that I minded. I had nothing to hide from her. And a woman who doesn't snoop after her man is either highly moral or doesn't care enough. Eudora Ann Chambers, née Morton, was not highly moral." So I'm curious what that's alluding to. I don't know if he's just joking around, because they get up to a lot of sexual behavior in this book so far. But it's not gratuitous. It's frequent, and I think it just speaks to, you know, their new relationship here and how excited they are to start this new life together. Here is the anachronism, my friends. So I briefly tried to fact check this. Not that I didn't trust our friend over on the Discord, but I was curious myself if this was actually true. So Orville starts to give us a big info dump right here, and this is probably the weakest part, the most boring part of the chapter. In fact, this is the part of the book that I actually kind of got a little bit bored in. I'm not a fan of a lot of exposition, and this book has been pleasantly light in that regard, but here we get a lot of information. Luckily, the rest of the chapter, the second half of the chapter, is completely amazing, but I will talk about it briefly here. So photography, turn of the century. You know those old portraits where nobody's smiling, everyone's standing completely still because it took a long time to expose, right? The exposure time on these old cameras was a long time. However, our sleuth on the Discord alerted me to the fact that by the turn of the century, cameras were quite quick. And that is actually when Kodak was created as well. And they were widely available to the consumer. I couldn't really find much on how quickly those took to develop, but that is when photography became very widespread, not just for professionals, but for anybody who wanted to snap a shot here and there. But as noted here in the highlight, portraits from around the turn of the century usually made people come off stiff and doll-like because they had to hold their expression so long, which seems to be incorrect. I'm sorry, unless they were using a very old camera, but it feels like Mr. Buehlman made a little bit of a mistake here, and I think that's okay. It's kind of interesting though, because it seems like this has a lot of history behind it. This entire book is very steeped in history, right? We have this guy who's a historian. He's a professor. He's digging into the history of his family. Slavery is obviously a big part about the story. So it just makes me wonder: are there other things in this tale that may be anachronisms? I guess we shall find out, because we do have, as I said, some very keen eyes on the Discord and reading this book along with us. So thank you, Vince, for pointing that out. I appreciate it. It got me looking more into the history of photography, and I think that's what's great about these read-alongs too, is just we all learn together, right? We learn a little bit together. And the next strange clue we get about his mother is that she is 18, but she has the eyes of a 30-year-old. So what does that mean? Well, we learn that she grew up too fast. She ran away, but he believes she ran away because he believes his maternal grandfather had taken liberties with her for quite some time. It was these liberties, I believe, which had provoked her to run away from Whitbrow to Atlanta at 15, where she found work first in vaudeville and then with a Shakespeare troupe. So not only do we learn about the abuse that his mother was subjected to by his grandfather, but also some more buddies that we meet. A man named Dan, who was christened Guinea Granny because of his name and the tiny wireframe glasses that were always slipping down his nose. And they all had glasses, but his looked like an old lady's, and he was unmistakably Italian, so the name stuck for good. And they were fast friends for a very long time, so in short, we were inseparable from the 4th grade until the shelling at Nine Elms Trench on the Somme, which was in the July of 1918. We were so goddamn eager to go. We were so stupid. I love that because we know that war has traumatized quite greatly our protagonist, Orville. And it's brought up numerous times in different capacities, but I think it's really giving us a good glimpse into his character and sort of what makes him afraid. We'll see how that manifests in the story, though. I'm really curious because, again, they are spending quite a bit of time on it. And I feel like it's good to show his trauma. You know, it helps us feel for him, and a lot of these memories do lend themselves to the tone of the book and sort of the story as it's unfolding as well. And so I think it works here. And finally, in the second scene of the story, he is in the river. He made it around 2 o'clock, but he crosses the river by foot. He tucked his socks into them and waded out to test the depth of the water because it was difficult to see. And so he took a little bit of a risk. And what's interesting here is Lester Gordeau's instructions had included a landmark called Magi Rock, which was as far as he had claimed to have ever gone in that direction. So, of course, we know our protagonist is going to go a little bit farther, right? Because he's a curious man. He's not as afraid. He doesn't know really what's going on in these woods, and he's trying to make light of the situation, at least to a degree. And here's an interesting description of it. So that Lester says, when you get about 1.5 miles past the river, keeping to the trail, you come to a little spring called Magi Rock. It ain't too big, but the water out of it is cold, good drinking, except that tastes like it come out of a skillet. It's supposed to be bad luck to drink out of it, or not to drink out of it. I can't recall. There's all kinds of stories about them once past the river. And then it hits our protagonist, Orville. Magi, I said when I saw it, as in the three magi, the biblical magi. And we see three separate but connected shelves of rock that are rising to chest level, each of them producing a small trickle of water that drained off into a sort of a sink. And orange stains beneath the spigots and in the sink testified to large quantities of iron in the water, which I tasted when I cupped my hand beneath the central spigot and put it in my mouth. Cold. The source was deep. Ancient, perhaps. Old. And it makes me wonder if the mention of the iron in the water is going to somehow link back to maybe the mental state of these creatures. I'm curious. There's a lot of little hints here and there, and I don't know if they're just set dressing, if they're just to make it feel more believable, or in fact these things are going to make some kind of sense in the story. I should have looked up iron, excessive iron. Let's do it really quick. So according to this site, I know maybe I'm hypothesizing a little bit too much here, but yes, past Jason, this is future Jason. You are hypothesizing a bit too much because I don't know why it didn't hit me. I'm an idiot. What is iron? Iron is in what? What is iron in? Come on, guys. Blood. Iron is heavy in blood. When we say something tastes like iron, it is the blood. It is the iron in the blood. I'm not sure why I get this always after the fact, but anyway, on with the show. And he equates the taste of this water to a well in England, where I had convalesced after my injury in France. His dad had pulled strings, so he got a good long leave overseas before he came home for decommissioning. And the reason why I like that is because he's talking about an old country, a country that's been around for a very, very long time. But he notes here, everything in England was so tidy, though, because, you know, civilization has been over there for a long time. And you don't often think about this, right? You think about the United States as being very modern, very civilized, not too much untamed wilderness. But in fact, there's quite a bit of untamed wilderness here. And I think the most interesting thing is, even though the Native Americans were here, we're an extremely new country. We're like the newest country. And so here he notes that America was the wild one now. So we didn't have everything figured out, particularly in this time, or everything mapped. We still don't. There's still massive swaths of forest and land that are just completely untamed. And it's interesting to think about that, because I think a lot of times when we're reading books about folklore and so on and so forth, and things that are magical or mysterious or anything in that regard, we're thinking about Europe, perhaps Asia, the old country, I guess, the old countries. But when you think about it, America is the newest one. And arguably there could be a lot of places that are uncovered. A lot of mystery is yet to be uncovered. And I think that's what's so compelling about horror set in the United States. And what does he find next? He finds pine trees had begun again to compete with their deciduous cousins. Two of them stood on opposite sides of the trail like columns, like some sort of gate. They had both been gouged. By what? He couldn't tell what they were gouged with, but he does make note here that I knew that sap was gathered by making slaves notch the trees on both sides and take from them until the trees died and could be burned to make tar. These two pines did not bear the marks of agriculture. They had been savaged, just the level of a grown man's trouser pockets. No saw or axe had done this, but I was hard-pressed to say what had. I did not know if the gouges were intended to discourage further exploration, but looking at them gave me a curious feeling in my groin. That's kind of ironic considering what happens next. We meet Mr. No Pants Sharp Teeth, because he gets a little excited, if you guys remember. But let's not get ahead of ourselves just yet. And as he pushes his way through the forest, he starts thinking about past events. Like I thought about Cranmer crouching in the trees near the burnt down house. You know, wondering why he hadn't noticed him. What was Martin hiding to keep an eye on him, or was he just going about his business, like he said, finding these rabbits? And Dora also seems to not like Cranmer very much. And he asks himself, had she gotten any extra earful of gossip about him when she was in town? So he's in this mysterious forest, and he's thinking about all these players around him who are leading him to question things, their motives, or what they're doing, and why his girlfriend, well, his fiancée, his wife, to be anyway, is not liking Cranmer, because he seems like a pretty likable guy. He's a little weird, but he's definitely a funny guy. And then we learn more about his history in England, where he had worked several weeks for the gardener at the Chalice Well, less for the money than for the excuse to linger around the odd little town. The spigot in the well had been made in the shape of a lion's head, and the water had been clean and cold and rusty, just like the water out of Magi Rock. So I'm curious if there's going to be a tie there, if again that's just sort of linking some kind of old world folklore horrific things, creatures maybe, from the old world to the new world, or maybe if it's just for our own benefit, right? We're thinking along with our protagonist, we're wondering along with them. And that's some of my favorite stuff in fiction is when we don't know and the protagonist doesn't know. I think that's cool because we're trying to figure out the story along with him or her. Oh, and I highlighted this next part. There was a cat the girl I was sleeping with called Bully. And I only highlight this because I'm actually slowly reading alongside this book, actually. I didn't even know it was by Christopher Buehlman until I started this book, but it's called The Black-Tongued Thief, and it's a fantasy novel. And there is a cat, a blind cat in that story that our protagonist picks up, and his name is Bully Boy. And so it makes me wonder if that was an intentional thing where Christopher Buehlman was just kind of like, hey, I'm going to drop this in here, and people who read my other stuff are going to get a little Easter egg, or if it's just something he did out of his subconscious. Either way, Bully Boy, the cat, that was kind of a cool little find there. And again, we're reminded again of the horrors of war and how they affected our protagonist. So when he says, my own wounds had still been fresh then, particularly those inside. But the waters of the well had helped to make me whole. I believe that, and I wasn't the only one who thought there was something to the stories about that place. So we're dealing with other kind of magical healing places, and he's again equating it to these this magi rock that he discovered with the iron water. And this place he says it has mostly healed him again. So 20 years old and through with God, whose ears I believed had numbed with too much prayer or deafened from the noise of shelling. I had asked that place to heal me, and it had, mostly. So he has turned away from God. We already kind of knew that pretty much from his discussion with Martin Cranmer when he asked him if he was a religious man, and he said no. But now we know why. I mean, we didn't necessarily know it was from the war. I guess we could have theorized that based on how much it affects him or how much it has affected him. But now we know for sure. And again, he's comparing this forest to Glastonbury. So this forest was a place, too, emphasized on place. The way Glastonbury had been a place. There was something powerful here, something beyond the reach of light bulbs and combustion engines. It was soon after I got going again that I began to feel watched. And here is where it comes, everybody. So that's a great segue. He understands that there's something powerful, something important, something ancient about this forest he's in, something that just has something to it. And then he feels like he's being watched. And we know he has lost his hearing from the war as well, or it's been dimmed a little bit. So he stopped and opened his mouth, which I often did to help my blighted hearing. And I think all of these characteristics, all of the stuff that Christopher Buehlman has been seeding is coming to fruition, right? It's going to start affecting the narrative. He's scarred. He's missing his little finger. He can't hear very well. And he's also reminded of this well over in England when he was serving in the war. And he hears something. He knows something's out there. He thinks it might be the pigs, but of course, pigs don't make these sounds. Crows fly away from the trees. He calls for, he wonders if it's Cranmer anyway. I didn't know the man well enough after all to know what sort of monkey shines he was capable of, so he calls to him. And this is what kind of makes this scene a little bit unique, a little bit interesting, is that he tries to make light of it. And I'm sure you guys have all been in that situation. If you've ever been afraid, if you've ever been, you think you're being stalked, right? In your house, outside of your house, whatever it is, you try to make light of the situation. You try to make yourself laugh because you don't want to be faced with a horror. And that's exactly what Orville's doing here. Especially when he starts off with, "It is I, Nanook of the North, and I come in peace." And that is when he saw him. The boy stepped into view. A thin, pale mulatto, just entering puberty. I knew this because the boy wasn't wearing pants, just a dirty shirt that stopped at his navel. So that's a very haunting image. I just picture this kid out in the forest in the distance. And again, there's something about that open distance that is creepy. This is kind of like Pennywise from It, right? Standing far enough away to where, but just close enough to where you can get a good glimpse of him. And it's kind of a creepy visage, especially this kid who is half naked out there. He's half black, he's half white. He's wearing a dirty shirt and he's naked. And he's not answering him. He's just staring at him. And this was a particularly chilling line. It was clear that he had not come forward because he had been discovered. It was simply time for me to see him. And there's a lot of elements like that where I've highlighted here that were, I just felt like extremely effective to convey the horror. But again, our person, Orville keeps trying to make light of it, waving your pecker about in the breeze like a primal man. That's first class. No effect whatsoever. And here's an interesting aside. I remembered a French poilu who called one light-skinned mulatto gravedigger café au lait during those bleak days of the Moose Offensive. How I laughed with the other soldier just to have someone laugh with. Besides, café au lait would be shoveling dirt over our blanched faces soon enough. Café au lait. It occurred to me to shout that at the boy who was stalking me now, and I felt disgusted with myself. How easily the paint of civilization peels off with a little bad weather. That's a very wise line right there. And so, as we know, obviously, this book deals with slavery, and so racism is a very big part of it. And he's recognizing that fact here, right? That it doesn't take much to tear you back down to this disgusting, as he refers to it, state. How easily the paint of civilization peels off with a little bad weather. Couldn't say it better myself. And he gives up with this comedic angle, and he says, just say something. He just shouts it. And then the boy, he starts throwing stones at him. And his face, only too lucid, bore a hint of a smile. And the meaning was clear. Yes, by all means, chase me off the path. And when night comes, I will show you other games besides the following and the rock throwing. He's getting inside his own head. He's pretty creeped out right now. And this scene accelerates to something different that I was joking about earlier. When I looked up, I noticed that the boy had the beginning of an erection. I stared. Just when I decided that the stone thrower was a lunatic, the boy did something that disturbed me more than anything thus far. Though he had no trousers, he mimicked the gesture of a man reaching for something in his pocket. A watch. He opened the pretend pocket watch, looked at it, and then looked up at the sky. It will be dark soon. The boy smiled fully then. His teeth had been filed sharp. Finally, we get the glimpse of sharp teeth, of the nature of the wolf. Maybe, maybe not. We'll see, but I think it's close enough so far. Fantastic ending to a chapter. His teeth had been filed sharp. I love that. Great ending. It made me want to continue. And of course I continued into chapter 8. And in this next scene, this chapter is actually a collection of very short scenes, which is kind of interesting. So he's bailing, he's booking it through these woods. He finds Cranmer's cabin, and we get a little glimpse of his cabin. So and the disarray, I guess, that it's in. So I walked past the odds and ends of Cranmer's yard, an axe buried in a tree stump, a loose circle of stones describing a fire pit, an old boiler pitted with rust, a dry rotten saddle, and the still Martin had mentioned. It was a great mystery to me how anyone could make liquor out of such an improvised mess. A copper tub, a series of barrels. Anyway, you get the idea. His place is in shambles. He's got junk everywhere. It's like a junkyard in his front yard. But what happens? He goes to Cranmer for help. He's like, what's going on? I need to get the hell out of here. And what does he say? Invitation doesn't apply tonight. Go the hell home. And then he slams the door in his face. So we know in this very short bit here, our protagonist, he takes a fall on the bike, but then he spots his wife when he's getting there, and she has the parasol of his mother. It is one that had belonged to my mother when she used to stroll around downtown Chicago 35 years ago. So full of beauty, it seemed the century would have to ask her permission to draw to a close. So a strange little vignette there. And the next scene is them laying in bed together, and he had been unwilling to make love to her, unwilling also to discuss why, because he is freaked out. So, she takes care of her own business, and that's okay. And the dream, he's lying there. He knows it's coming. Oh, it was coming, the dream. I lay staring up now, listening to what must have been every dog in town baying at the rich moon, shining china white past the lace curtains. Another image of werewolves. Will we get werewolves, everybody? I don't know. I kind of hope we don't. I kind of hope that Christopher Buehlman is leading us down this path to where we assume we're going to deal with these wolf people, but maybe they're just representing wolves with their filed down teeth. That's what I'm hoping for anyway. I'm really hoping we're not dealing with werewolves here, because that would be a little bit too on the nose, I think, particularly with the cover. But let me know what you think in the comments. Are you hoping for wolves? I know somebody out there who's reading along with this is. And so we get more visions of the war. And I highlighted this because this was a particularly beautiful bit of writing here that described the landscape quite effectively, at least in my opinion. The landscape had been so maimed by this new kind of warfare, it was as if human architects of great genius had sat down to plan hell, since no two of them could agree on the design of heaven. Mud and craters, rats and gas, barbed wire and the walking dead. Even in the rain, there always seemed to be a fire somewhere. The book of Revelations read like fairy tale poetry next to this harsh prose. So a great description, or at least I think it's evoking anyway how our protagonist feels about it. And then our protagonist gets in a firefight and a melee with the Germans, but he finds a boy. So he pried the shovel out of the boy's grip, and it fell too. And then we fell, bracing our hands against each other's faces. My little finger slipped inside the boy's mouth, and the boy bit down hard, which is how he lost his little finger. But in the real event, I had wrestled myself on top of the boy and held his face underwater while the rest of my company rushed past and over us to get at the other Germans, one of whom must have tossed the grenade, the potato masher. So we have kind of a contrast of his dream event and the real event of what happened here and how he appeared to have drowned a kid. But there's some great stuff about the child just in a bit here. But the war was over for me and for several others caught nearby. The doctor said the only reason the shrapnel that entered my back didn't kill me was because it had to pass through other matter first. I love this. I never learned which of my dead friends comprised that other matter, nor did I learn the fate of the boy beneath me. What I like about that is it's really pulling away from the humanity of something, because the doctor says it passed through matter, and he attributes that matter to human flesh. Human flesh is obviously a person, and so I just like that. It was a really interesting concept to dehumanize somebody, essentially. And this is a great part here where he's imagining what happened to this boy he had a little scuffle with. And I like it because, you know, we always regret decisions, particularly very terrible ones like this. And so he doesn't really know what happened to this boy, but he hopes that he lived and he has a good life. And so he's almost fantasizing about this. So he says, I like to imagine the boy surviving to robust manhood. My favorite daydream placed him on a farm in Bavaria, teaching a healthy blonde son the game of locking middle fingers with an opponent and pulling to see whose grip was stronger. But the dream was different. The boy and I sat up like children playing in the mud. Where are your pants, my friend? We're bringing it back to the boy in the forest. The boy clamped my wrist in an unbreakable grip and bit off the little finger at the knuckle, but he did not stop there. He ate every finger I had. And finally he wakes up. He's freaked out. Dora tries to console him, and he calls her a sphinx again. He's obsessed with sphinxes. We were talking about that on the Discord too, which is very animalistic. So we'll see if that manifests into anything. A man goes on 4 legs in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and uses a cane at night. It was funny because I think earlier on in the book he said 3 legs at night, which was, you know, hinting at some naughty action, I guess you could say. But now it's a cane because he's in a very different mental state. And in fact, that is a bit of a 3rd leg, I guess, as well. And she says, "You're okay, Frankie, you're home." And she kissed his fingers, which is the last place he wanted to be kissed. And he jerks his hand away. So a very interesting short chapter in chapter 8. I think we got, again, deeper into the head of our protagonist. He just kind of runs home out of the forest, denied by Mr. Cranmer, and runs home, has these terrible dreams, can't have sex with his wife. And we get a little bit of a glimpse again into his war stories, the horror that his PTSD, and also this boy, and then it ties back to the boy he met in the forest, and I love that. That was a great melding of these 2 horrors into one. So chapter 9, what happens in chapter 9? He's fine. He appears to be fine because he is, then her gaze shifted slightly off mine as she noticed the firmness I was developing under the sheet. So he's getting a little, you know, hungry for something, let's say. Even though before he couldn't sleep with her. But he starts to question himself too, right? He starts to, he's a little bit in denial perhaps, or maybe coping with that fact. So maybe I hadn't seen the boy at all. My exhaustion and the poor light had made my eyes play tricks on me. The bruises and welts weren't from stones, but from the little spill I took off Martin's bicycle. I nearly believed all this revisionism. And this is where I kind of got thrown off guard because this is the syphilis test, and I looked it up, and in fact, in 1935, it was instituted that premarital people who were about to get married had to get tested for syphilis. There's a interesting like poster about it. I'll have to, maybe if I find it, I'll post it up here. But it was something about protecting the family from syphilis because they didn't have a cure then, unfortunately. And then they go on a little trip, right? They go eat some food, and they start talking about the poverty of the town, and they see a guy carrying a mattress, I believe, and his family's looking at them as they drive by in their car. But there's little asides here that they're in their conversation. They're bringing up a lot of this while they're eating the food. I know they haven't. She says, "Do you know that the teacher of the lower grades makes a present of a bar of soap to her best pupil every month, and the kids fight over it? A bar of soap." And then she continues here, "They must have herds of wild pigs running around those woods." And he, of course, remembers the pigs and something else besides. Where are your pants, my friend? He's being haunted by this boy that he met in the forest still. And finally, we figured out, well, she says, her eyes shining with good humor, what we're actually here for is to see if we're going to expire from a horrid social disease. But while we're in town, it wouldn't hurt for us to see the picture show and try not to quarrel. And this final itty-bitty scene here, They go see a movie, and we get more of an idea of Orville's self-conscious nature about how he's second-guessing. He wants to know what Eudora's thinking when he says, "I wanted to peek into that lovely head and know what she was thinking, even if it hurt me, even if she was remembering a time before she knew me and thinking that was better." So he's constantly second-guessing his relationship with her, and it really illuminates more about himself than anything else. She seems to be extremely happy, but I can understand, because under the circumstances they met, maybe he's thinking like this is just some short thing. This isn't a big deal to her. If she did this once, could she do it again? So I totally get it. But on the 10th and final chapter of this episode of Those Across the River Read Along, episode 2, we are back with Martin Cranmer. They're playing chess. And he had built this crude little house from scratch, from the hickory beams to the pine shingles. All of this was very humbling to a man like me who had trouble hanging a painting without mashing his thumb. So they're sitting here playing chess. Actually, Orville gets the better of him, which is interesting. And Cranmer, he agrees. He says, I need to get out of here before I get upset. And he's drinking moonshine, and it's not even noon yet. He's taking drinks out of this jar, and he's asking him about this book he's going to write. And he's questioning, like, why do you want to write about this piece of shit, basically? And he's almost discouraging him of it because, and he answers him right here, because he makes people react just like you did, and because he's my great-grandfather. And he says, I know, but if I were you, I wouldn't go telling people that. And he says, why? People have long memories around here. We're in that situation again where we have a character who knows something that we don't know, that Orville doesn't know, and he's just not giving it up still. And he really wants to know what the hell's going on. And we know Orville loves history. I think that's why he's the perfect character for this story too. He's unafraid to delve into this dark past. And even though we may deem that as carelessness, as ignorance, even as something very stupid to do, I think he's the character we need for this, because he's constantly prodding these people. He's not sitting back on the sidelines and just dealing with accepting what everyone's going to tell him. But even amid all this, amid this disagreement, Mr. Cranmer, he's a hilarious man, because when he says, Orville says, I wrote my thesis on minor engagements peripheral to Sherman's march and touched on the action at the plantation then. And then he repeats, Martin does, peripheral to Sherman's march. Christ, it's sweet to hear a man use big words that aren't Bible names. And he asked him if he's in France, and of course he asks him, and he tells him the story of his buddy Danny, when he was in a trench, I believe, and a shell made impact. The concussion blew Danny against the side of the trench so hard his pants came half off, and a big loop of his guts came out of his back door. And Martin, of course says, Jesus, that'll fuck up somebody in a hurry. Yeah, he was done. And he turns it on him, right? And I love, Martin does this a lot. I meant you. When he had the bicycle conversation or the horror conversation, he flipped it. He made a ironic comment, and here he does it again, but with far greater depth, with far greater meaning for our protagonist. And probably the wisest line in this entire thing is something Orville is thinking when he says, one of the hardest and truest things a grown-up learns is that sometimes it's not okay. And Dan is just looking for his glasses. He doesn't think anything is wrong. And that's what's interesting about that. He's so in shock. He's like, if I find my glasses, everything's going to be okay. And then he went to go meet Dan's mom, and she made him some cookies and some tea, but he obviously didn't partake in any of that stuff. I guess the tea maybe, or the coffee, sorry. But he constantly felt that, her eyes on him, just, thinking that he should be the one who's dead and not her son. And one of the hardest and truest things a grown-up learns is that sometimes it's not okay. And indeed that is, we're constantly telling our children and, our loved ones that it's going to be okay, But, and inevitably all of our lives, we meet this head on, where we know that just sometimes it's not going to be okay. And this discussion intensifies. They're getting more and more angry at each other. He says, what do you know about it? You weren't in the AAF, were you? You said you hid in the woods. I didn't have to go to France to know France was a sack of shit. It's always a sack of shit, and I'm not blaming you for going. Blaming me? But then he says, but you ought to know better now. You ought to leave your general alone. Might not like what you find. So it makes me wonder if he knows what's going on to a degree. I feel like he does, or maybe he just knows enough to stay away. And he's imploring our protagonist to accept the same ignorance that he has. And he continues with that when he says, some things it's better not to be sure about. Would you agree with that? And Orville says, perhaps, I said, in general. But then Martin goes on. Suppose I were to tell you that something which is outside of your realm of understanding goes on in those woods across the river. Suppose I get specific. You then have no choice but to think that I have boiled my brain. Now suppose I tell you that nothing unusual at all is going on in those woods. You will then remember the way I acted the other night, and you will have no choice but to suppose that I have boiled my brain. So you can see what he's getting at here. He's damned if he does, he's damned if he doesn't. But then Orville, he fires back, if you dodge checkmates like you dodge questions, be a match for Capablanca. And he persists still. Orville, he persists when he says, do you cross the river, Martin? Just point blank. And Martin says, and if you don't like the way I acted on the night of the full moon, stay away from me then and stay home. Think of those woods as a beautiful woman, fine to play around with most of the month, but on certain days, go if you want, but don't wear your best shirt. That's all I have to say about the subject. So I love that because he turns something that is hilarious. That's a great quip there. But then there's horror on it, and there's obviously blood involved. And so that's a beautiful bit of dialogue there. I really love this character quite a bit. And finally, the last section of this chapter, I highlighted this entire thing because it is quite notable. And I'm very pleased with the way these chapters are ending. They're great hooks. They're great ends to just want you to continue to read more. So I will read it for you here. On my way out the door, I paused for a moment when another piece of Martin's handiwork caught my eye. It was a carved wooden diorama featuring a scale model of Miller's General Store, complete with a tiny checkerboard and a shot glass for a pickle jar. All the regulars were stuffed mice. An overstuffed mouse in an apron was clearly Paul Miller. A strong-looking mouse in overalls represented a fellow named Buster Sims, whom I would get to know soon. There was a one-armed mouse too, and we know that guy. We met him a couple times. And then Martin says, "Don't bother looking," he said. "You're not in it. Not yet." So what does that mean? What does that mean? I have no idea, but the plot thickens. I think things are being revealed at a slower pace, but I like it. I think I'm not really bored at all. And I think this is why I think it's very difficult to write horror novels, because inevitably you want stuff to happen, but you can't have stuff happening all of the time. Otherwise, it's going to wear you thin. It's going to become ordinary. It's going to become boring. And so you have to really tease this stuff out. And I think Christopher Buehlman's doing a great job so far. I'm enjoying it. So let me know what you're thinking about the book so far. Do you find it too slow? Do you find it boring, a drag, any or all of the above? Let me know. But for next week, let us read the next 5 chapters. So chapters 11 through 15. And don't forget, join the Discord if you're not already there. We are having a very lively discussion about this book. The good things, the bad things, the disagreements we all have. But thanks for hanging out with me. I know these are long videos, but I enjoy making them. I enjoy pulling these things apart and seeing not only what you guys reveal to me, but also what I can reveal to you, hopefully. Next week, chapters 11 through 15. Thanks for watching, and I will see you then.